For nearly the past 2 years, I've used the DZO Vespid primes for the majority of my filming projects, from commercial work to personal stuff. I've done a full video on them, but the long story short is I really like where they sit between ultra sharp lenses and vintage lenses. They're like slap bang in the middle, making them a nicely balanced cinema lens. So when DZO asked if I wanted to check out their new Pictor 14-30, I was definitely curious how it would hold up. The short answer is it held up very well. In fact, I went out and bought the 20-55 Pictor Zoom and also the 55-125 to complete the full Pictor Zoom set. However, this video is going to be all about the 14-30, and just to make it very clear, this is not going to be a technical review. I'm not going to be talking about the fine details of the chromatic aberration or shooting any charts or doing anything like that. I'm just going to talk about how I use the lens and my experience of using the lens on various different productions. With that being said, there are some technical bits to cover first. Parfocalness is the ability of a lens to stay in focus at all the different focal lengths in the zoom range. This is very, very important because it means you can zoom in and out with your subject staying in focus. This is a key feature to the performance of all cinema zooms. Now, my Pictor Zoom actually arrived with a PL mount and I had to swap it over to the EF mount, which meant I had to do a little bit of shimming, which kind of terrified me, but following all of the instructions online, I managed to get my 14-30 fully parfocal within around about 30 minutes. It was pretty painless. Focus breathing, which is unwanted zooming when focusing, is very well controlled on the 14-30. Is not non-existent like it is on my Vespid primes, but it certainly doesn't breathe quite as heavily as some Darth Vader zooms do. The weight is 1.9 kilograms and it uses a 0.8 gear pitch on the fizz rings, and the rings and front diameter are all consistent for the full set of Pictors. 95mm external front diameter, 86mm internal with a thread. The 14-30 is T2.8 or wide open and has a close focus of 0.6 meters, 16 iris blades, and it covers super 35mm sensors. So that is the technical bits all covered. So let's talk about the interesting stuff, which is actually the way the lens looks and feels and the character of it, which is all very subjective and is likely to cause some arguments down in the comment section. It has a look that falls into that sweet spot. It's not so wacky and so characterful that clients are going to start freaking out, but equally there is a little bit of character there. You can use it for jobs that require a clean look, but it's not so clean that it starts looking sharp and clinical. I generally shoot with a 1/4 pro mist in front just to soften things off a tiny bit and allow things to bloom a little bit more, and then generally I'll film wide open at T2.8, which just gives it a slightly creamy, again, softer look. Color-wise, the 14-30 does run really quite warm. It's significantly warmer than the other Pictor Zooms, which I found a little bit disappointing, but equally, color temperature differences are very easy to iron out through a white balance change or just through a quick corrective grade, so it hasn't presented any enormous issues for me. And in terms of contrast and clarity, it definitely lives in the same world as the other Pictor Zooms, so that's great. The flares are big and bloomy, and with the number of elements that you have in the lens, you just end up with a bunch of cool shapes on the image, which is always quite satisfying. Barrel distortion in the wide and a little bit of pin cushioning at the longer end of the lens is definitely present, but and this is potentially a little bit controversial, I personally really enjoy that sort of distortion, especially the very subtle barrel distortion of 14mm. I think it looks really nice. It reminds me of vintage wide angle lenses. And remember, I came into filmmaking through BMXing and skate films. Spike Jonze is basically my hero, so I'm definitely biased in this department. The bokeh is smooth, it's undistracting, there's definitely nothing horrid happening in the out of focus zones, but it's also worth remembering this is a T2.8 ultra wide angle zoom. Bokeh just isn't that much of a factor because it's not really going to be that present. So I think that covers all of the bases that make up the character of a lens, and in summary, I like it. I think it's subtly characterful and it has some visually pleasing flaws. So how do I use them on set? When it comes to big commercial projects where I've got quite a big crew and I've got ACs and things, I still tend to favor the Vespid primes for my A camera. However, I will always have the 14-30 hooked up to my Pocket 6K Pro, balanced up on a gimbal at all times. I will always use a zoom lens on the gimbal because swapping out primes on a gimbal is frustrating. You have to rebalance things. So that sits there, and that is specifically there for capturing the establishing wides and those sorts of floating, arcing mid shots that I absolutely love. For the large majority of my filming projects, the Pictor Zooms live on the gimbal and they complement the shots that I get on my Ursa with the Vespid primes. But also, since getting the zooms, I found myself using them in ways that I wasn't really expecting. For example, the Razer commercial tool, which was meant to be playful and is meant to be kind of like very in the moment and just capturing things that are happening. I had the 14-30 on the camera for probably about 90% of that commercial, and I was zooming in and out. I even left some of the zooms actually in the final cut, and I was punching in, picking things up, pulling right the way out to the 14mm wides and just kind of floating around, swinging the camera about. I wanted it to feel DIY. I wanted to film in a reactive fashion, and shooting on the zooms allowed me to do that, and it captured the essence of that really nicely. I've also found myself leaning into some crash zooms. You can just get creative. It's a new tool in the visual toolkit, and I'm a big fan of adding tools to my visual toolkit. I guess all of that could be said for any zoom, but it helps that the 14-30 is a good zoom. It's a really solid piece of kit. It's a lovely lens. I would definitely be using it for future projects, and I look forward to what I create with it in years to come. Yeah, I think that wraps things up. Cool. See ya.